Well, let's get going. So welcome everyone to today's presentation on how individual actions lead to conservation wins. My name is Brian Fainer, and I'm with the National Park Service and help support our Connected Conservation initiative, which focuses on how the NPS and partners can improve conservation and improve the connectivity of natural, cultural, and recreation resources. Today's presentation is the 8th in a series of webinars that is focusing on how individuals can help nature and parks. Throughout today's presentation, please feel free to enter any questions you have for our presenters into the questions tab, and we'll review the questions following the presentations. There's also closed captioning available for those who are interested, and there's a link to that in the chat box. You can register for future webinars in our mini series and view our extensive library of past recordings by going to our NPS Connected Conservation homepage. And again, there's a link to that in the chat box as well. Lastly, as a reminder, our webinar series is open to the public, so we encourage you to invite your friends and colleagues to future presentations. So let me now introduce our two excellent presenters. Brandon Schauer, am I saying your last name correct?
Schauer, like rain.
Perfect. Schauer is the Senior Vice President for RARE's Climate Culture Program, which works to empower people to make a difference at home, in their communities, and at work so that people and nature thrive. The program works to popularize individual actions that can reduce emissions significantly while strengthening the constituency demanding climate positive policies. Adam Snyder is the Senior Director of Strategy for the Global Conservation Campaigns team at the Nature Conservancy. The Global Conservation Campaigns team conducts political and policy and public advocacy campaigns to generate funding and policy outcomes that conserve the lands and water on which we all depend. Adam oversees all public funding efforts of the team, which have helped generate more than $112 billion for conservation. So thank you, Brandon and Adam, for all your efforts and for presenting today. And with that, I'm going to turn off my webcam and turn the floor over to you, Brandon.
Hey, thank you so much. And it's so great to be here and be able to spend time talking together. I'll just say national parks people are my type of people. I love it, as I'm sure you do, as a great national institution. And so what I wanted to start today with, and I thought would be helpful to step into the topic for you, would be a story. Imagine you are at a cafe in California where they're serving lunch, and you get in line and someone hands you a survey and says, hey, we're conducting a quick survey. Would you mind answering a few questions? You'll get a coupon for money off of your meal when you get to the front of the line. You're standing in line anyway, so you take the survey, right? So this was actually a survey designed to say how are they affected by the different framings around eating a plant-based diet. A plant-based diet is something that has less meat and therefore has less emissions, carbon emissions related to it. So everyone in line in this study, because this was actually a formally conducted study, everyone in line got one of 3 studies. One was just a control group, so we won't talk too much about it. But one group got an introduction that said, hey, we want you to know before you take the rest of the survey, some people limit how much meat they eat. And they had the respondent answer a number of questions about their meat eating. And then they got the ticket in return and got to the front of the line and had ordered their meal and went on. What they didn't maybe realize was that each of those little tickets they got to reduce the cost of their meal purchase was a unique identifier. And so everyone who answered this particular version of the survey with this introduction, it led to they were 17% more likely than the control group to order a plant-based meal, which is pretty interesting, right? You just introduce the topic and someone's 17% more likely to do it. But then another group the third group got a slightly different introduction. And it said, some people are starting to limit how much meat they eat. And shockingly, this got a huge, was a 17% percentage point increase of people then going to the front of the line and ordering a plant-based meal. So what's going on here? This is what the researcher Greg Sparkman calls a dynamic norm, that you give the framing that the norm is not stable. It's not just some people do this and it's always going to be a certain percentage of people who do this. He created what's called a dynamic norm by introducing it differently and saying, hey, some people are starting to do this. This is starting to be a trend. People are starting to change. And we don't want to be left behind, right? We want to try something new if people are going to be starting to do it as well, right? And so this actually, just a slight difference in framing to create this dynamic norm, created quite a bit of difference in people's personal behaviors. So this is an interesting, what we call a behavioral science insight, because the framing, a difference in communication, led to a different change. It helped Americans change because they believed others were changing, so they start to change too. And this kind of research is common to what my organization, RARE, does, is trying to use the elements of behavior science to help people change their behaviors so that they themselves and nature around them can thrive. Historically, we've done quite a bit of this. Over decades, we've run more than 450 behavior campaigns in many different countries. They are often around fisheries, where people go from very difficult fishing challenges, like literally dynamite fishing, to restorative fishing practices. Our approaches lead to quite good increases in behavior adoption. Our average campaigns increase adoption by about 18 percentage points, which is way more than typical awareness campaigns that go on in the single-digit kind of levels. But having done this, having seen the magic of what behavior science can do for creating the kind of outcomes we all want to see, we've taken some of these insights and started to direct it at the world's largest emitters per person, which are Americans. Here in the US, we emit more per person in terms of carbon, the climate change producing carbon, than anyone else in the world. So I think one of the things that often comes up is just, hey, there's system changes. There are things that governments and corporations should be doing and could be doing to have big impact. And it would be really, what's conveyed sometimes is that it has to be a choice. Either big organizations and governments act, or individuals do something. But individuals can only do so much in their life. They don't have the scale of, say, a large corporation or a government. And so these get set up as a false dichotomy, right? You can only do one or the other. And what I want to introduce in today's conversation is just like, it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, in many cases, these are codependent, right? It's hard to sometimes make a change without systems change, but it's also hard for systems changes to happen without individual changes coming along with them. So really, there's two chapters to what I want to convey. First, that individual actions do matter, they do really add up. And then second, that individual action is actually a required part of systems change, that we're all part of the system. So we'll start with, of course, the individual actions that really do add up. So first of all, Americans are ready to make climate change personal and do something in their personal lives. First of all, we just know that belief in climate change is not a 50-50 thing. There's a vast majority of Americans who do believe it's happening, 76%, and increasing all the time. That 70% of Americans then are either very or somewhat worried about climate change. So it's something that's very present with them, right? It's anxiety producing, and a lot of people feel it. And finally, when we look at people's attitudes about doing something themselves, when we ask, hey, if it's not just government, if it's not just corporations, do you yourself have a sense of responsibility for doing something? 65% of people have said yes. And this is all according to Yale's climate change communication program. So there's a real need to do something. The next question is, do Americans actually know what to do? And so RARE ran a study and said, hey, amongst these actions, which ones are very important, and you could really do something if you about your emissions if you took this action. And the #1 question from Americans of what they could do for climate change was recycle. And certainly we don't want people to stop recycling, but unfortunately this isn't even necessarily a top 25 answer in terms of what Americans can do. And so that begs the question of, okay, what can they do? What are the important actions? The good news is those are knowable, and it's not an incredibly long list in terms of things that start to really add up. Rare ran a study, we've written about it and published about it to find out what things both have the biggest impact, many people can do, and there's some momentum behind it in terms of ability to do these things. And they fall into 4 different areas of your life. Food, how you eat, do you eat less meat, as we were just discussing before? Could you cut your food waste? Transportation in terms of how you get around and flying less. Energy consumption, can you switch to clean energy or get solar? And finally, nature, that carbon credits as a project that you can donate to is a really good way to have a high impact in terms of what you do. If you do donate, it's a really good place to spend some funds in terms of the impact it can have. So if you start looking at what these could do, we modeled each of these behaviors against 10% of Americans adopting it. The same 10% of Americans don't have to adopt all of these. Any segment of America could adopt 1 or more. And we looked at the kind of impact, and it's about 120 coal-fired power plants annually would be removed. It's the equivalent of that if people adopted these behaviors. Another way of thinking about it, it's roughly similar to the size of the total emissions of the United Kingdom, right? So it's a big part of the system that could be changed by Americans starting to adopt these behaviors. These actions also have impact globally, but there can be some different lists because globally there are different grids, there are different solutions that are accessible to you, and so different groups have done a good job of showing what actions make sense across the globe, global north, different groups like that. But to point out, Project Drawdown, for example, took their solution list and said, okay, which ones are really the ones that individuals could do and have the biggest impact? And their findings said, hey, globally, individual and household actions have the potential to reduce 25 to 30% of the total emissions that we need to reduce to avoid the dangerous climate change, the climate change that would impacts that would have us rising over 1.5 degrees Celsius globally. So really interesting how these change per geography, but mostly rare, and this conversation will focus on the ones in the US. So we've covered like, hey, people are up to the idea of changing. We know which behaviors are important to change, but how do you actually engage people in it? And so I'm going to introduce 3 different levers that we think are the strongest in terms of the research and piloting we've been doing to get people engaged in these. First is social expectations. Very much like that first story I told you at the cafe. You have to believe that others are doing it and that others think it's going to be important for you to do, that it's expected of you to do these things. Another one is just what we call efficacy, this idea that I can do it, right? I have the know-how, or I have the ability to change my diet or get solar or do some of these other tasks. The belief that we as a group could do it, we as a neighborhood, we as a employee group, something like that, and that we can actually get the benefits and co-benefits of the results that are promised. And then finally, we love things that are easy, right? So to what extent can we make it easier to do some of these things? Some of them feel easy, like switching your diet, but we all know at the end that can be very hard. Or some of them are just logistically tough, like putting solar on your roof, or logistically tough might be figuring out what kind of EV is right for you. But if it's materially easier as well as logistically easier, you can get a lot more people on board to adopt. So our program tends to focus on the spaces where we can see other people out there changing. So spaces like social media, where we literally are watching what other people are doing, workplaces where it matters a lot to you what your coworkers are thinking of you, what they're doing, what are they trying out, in your community with the people you live and play around, as well as entertainment. We can learn off of characters on screen just as much as we can learn from people, friends and colleagues in our own lives about what good or bad happens to them because of the choices they make or the behaviors they choose to take on. So just take one of these, entertainment, how in the world does that work? I chose appropriately for this venue, Our Great National Park series on Netflix, where you could watch the series, but you could also run into social media. This is former president talking about the series and guiding people to a site, which is Wild for All, where you can learn about your ability to take action and then lead someone to actually what's called a climate action platform, where their steps, their actions can be supported with the right information or support to solutions that they can use to approach and take on the new action, and then their action is counted. So we actually can see like change taking place over time, which is really, really exciting to see. So those individual actions really can add up, but also more and more we're realizing that individual action is going to be required for systems change to really take place. So great news, even a bit surprising news in terms of how it came out, but the Inflation Reduction Act includes almost nearly $400 billion in climate funding, right? And it's projected that if adoption is what they hope it is, that by 2030, we can reduce 40% of US carbon emissions. Huge, great. But when you start to look at it, there is what you call in supply chain and healthcare, telecommunications, even development issues, a last mile problem, where, hey, a lot of the systems is there, but someone actually has to decide to take an action that will lead to a tax incentive. Someone has to actually choose to buy an EV rather than an internal combustion engine to get that tax incentive. So it's all coming back to, hey, can we get citizens, individuals in America to do the things that will get them the tax incentives that has been modeled out in that legislation. So the IRA has really covered one of these levers that we tend to look at on the right here, material incentives. It has really helped make it more possible to financially get into some of these behaviors, but it doesn't use these other sort of levers that I've been walking through to really help people adopt. So if you look at the IRA from a behavioral standpoint, you'll see on the left, these are really the actions the legislation starts to ask Americans to do. It's asking people to switch from their normal utility bill to a community solar model, weatherize their home, install smart electric panels, things like this, which in the center you see have expenses associated with them, but also nice incentives. So it's really helped address that. But what it's hasn't yet addressed, what the legislation on its own doesn't address, is that some of these are very complex things. If you look at them, the number of components in putting a solution together as an individual, they can get pretty complex. If you look at the duration of them, things like getting a rooftop solar could take months, whereas switching to community solar could just take hours. So these are the things that we as humans think through of like, do I really want to go and get that incentive? Well, it's going to take all this work and effort and time, and do I want to do it? And I have to weigh that out. But also on the right is this important lever of, do I sense other people are doing it? And some of these behaviors are super visible, like an EV. You can see them going down the street. You can see if your neighbor has one in their driveway. But some of them are very behind the scenes. Like, I don't go around people's backyard seeing if they have a heat pump. Same thing, talkability. Sometimes we might talk cars, but we're very unlikely to, have a conversation where smart electric panels just pop up. And so how do we make these more visible, more social, and more normal? Because as Americans, as human beings, our expectations of what others think is normal, what is right, matters a lot. And so that can really accelerate people adopting things like the tax incentives of the IRA. If we look, for example, at solar panels, only Americans, we've surveyed them, Americans say only 3 out of 10 people they know would actually believe installing solar panels is important. But in reality, nearly 6 out of 10 Americans think. So we're ignorant about how important other people think these behaviors are. And this is something that can be really used to create that dynamic norm that we talked about at the start. So a last point to kind of bring this home, this notion of solar panels. A study's been done to show that the best predictor of whether you're going to be getting solar panels if you're a homeowner isn't the zip code you live in, it isn't your income range, it's actually whether your neighbor has solar. So your neighbor might explain how to get it, it might make it easier, but it also creates this sense of, like, could you imagine being this poor person between two neighbors who both have solar? Like, you feel the intense need that you're missing out, you're going to want to know from them the benefits, the how to, and you're likely to get solar as well. So this is why I began with this assertion of individual change and systems change. They're really part of a linked system that to do one, we need the other. It's not a false dichotomy. It's really something that works together.
Great, thanks, Adam.
Yeah, thank you, Brandon. That was great. And we're going to continue on that theme in a little bit different way. Talk about how our team works in individual action and systems change. Brian, if you're able to bring up there it is. Okay, thank you. We had some difficulty me doing it when we originally did this, so thank you, Brian, for running the show here. Moving on to the next slide. My team at the Nature Conservancy has been around for about 35 years, and we have done ballot initiatives that are about funding for conservation. It is where we have been our bread and butter, and we're applying a lot of those skills and tools in a policy and other areas to move individual and collective action. So this is a kind of an overview of our team. We kind of look at ourselves as a public affairs shop internally to TNC. We provide direct services to the Nature Conservancy staff. However, we work in coalition with partner organizations outside of TNC, and we are able to build upon that. So this is our track record of wins, and something that we're very proud about is that scoreboard there. As you saw, if you can go back one, Brian, just quickly, that we've been able to win nearly 90% of the time and over $125 billion over the last 35 years. And most recently, in the next slide, you'll see this is just this last election cycle, 17 of 18 measures passed that we were involved in and supported. That generated more than $7 billion in funding for conservation. And overall, 66% of the people supported the ballot measures across the board. That includes the one that failed in LA, that failed pretty handily, so that drew our numbers down a bit, but these others, and what we have is really a diversity of issues that we're looking at, and you see some of the logos here of some of the campaigns. You know, in the past, we were, the Nature Conservancy has been a bucks and acres type of organization in the past, so we really were focused on that, and that's where the most of our funding has gone. But now we're looking at more issues along equity and environmental justice. The Denver sidewalk measure is one in that, to make sure that we had more walkable communities across Denver. And we're talking about wildfire in the West in a few ballot measures. The Green Bond in Rhode Island has a myriad of different items in it. And then we have traditional work like in Cook County, Illinois, that is $1 billion ballot measure that protecting the forest preserves there. So that gives you a little bit of the history. I'm going to talk a little bit more on the next slide about how we go about doing this and where we're really driving towards. And we've developed this secret sauce. If you can go to the next slide, please, Brian. The secret sauce that we have developed is looking through this process to get to where the outcomes we need to get. And this is where we're really driving to individual action that adds up to collective action. We need people to vote on ballot measures and to influence their legislators and members of Congress to vote the right way. And enough of that pressure, enough of those votes results in the win that we're looking for. So we really work in this process here where we're focusing on the early planning and uniting diverse coalitions. It's very important that we bring partners to the table and are inclusive in that process, because developing our strategy without those votes, it makes it incomplete. So we're really trying to do that better as an organization and as a team to make sure that we get a full breadth of the areas and opportunities in which we work. Then the feasibility research, that can be funding feasibility, that can be policy feasibility research, needs assessments, economic research. All that goes into how we make the argument to the elected official, to the public, that the proposal that we have here, and many times what we're talking about is taxing people taxing themselves, that it is worth the pain to achieve this better outcome. And then public opinion research, which we'll talk a lot more about that in just a minute. But understanding that messages and messengers are so critical in this, and understanding, again, that pain point. We have seen, to what Brandon presented earlier, that we have a vast majority of support from the public as far as climate change, agree it exists, and want to see something to do about it. Once you ask them, how much are you willing to pay to do that, then we see our numbers decline, and that's where we've really struggled to pass climate change measures. A big one that was up a few years ago in Washington State failed after a lot of money put up against it. A lot of money was put for it. While it did fail at the ballot, because of the public opinion research and because we have that broad range support, that gave enough encouragement to the government leadership to go forward and do 2/3 of the things that were in that ballot initiative in the legislative session the next cycle. So while that was a loss, it was a win eventually, and it was based on the fact that we had that public opinion research that showed support. So then we move into the information sharing and expanding the coalition. That's when those first kind of green steps there are more things that we do internally and gather our research that we're setting the stage, and then we move more in the public advocacy campaigns, the external campaigns, and that's where we get into some of the fun stuff of advertising and messaging, very similar to some of the things that Brandon was talking about earlier. And then the final step is that implement and defend. And this is something you see kind of the dotted lines around it. It's something that we've added to our secret sauce in recent years, because we're seeing more and more times where, you know, these wins are not static. My partner is a doctor. When she has a bad day, you know, there are lives on the line. And when I have a bad day, it might be that my policy didn't pass or someone unraveled it. That doesn't mean I can't get up again tomorrow and work to protect it. So these wins that we have are static. They aren't. I mean, they aren't static. They're constantly in motion, and there's threats, there's tweaks, there's new opportunities to expand them. So making sure that we implement and defend the policy wins and public funding we have are so critical. Let's move on to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit more about the research that we do. This is just a sample of some things that we're looking at, the political aspect of things, electoral. Oftentimes, when we're working with politicians, they think the best time to go on the ballot is during a primary election, because that's usually when most politicians are elected nowadays, how gerrymandered many of our districts are. That actually, our research shows that's the worst time to put it on, because what you have is more people likely to vote no. And it's a smaller base of people to draw from. So you have a lot less people at the ballot at that time. So we really look to more general election time, especially during even year cycles of the congressional and presidential cycles, because you get much more people out to vote who are more likely to be with us. And so that's some of the political and electoral analysis, and then economic, making that case that this work can enhance the tax base, can protect from future expenses. What is the debt ratio? What are you looking at here? And then finally, some of the legal requirements, either for the ballot or the policy. We had one county looked at that really wanted to go to the ballot this year, and legally they couldn't because they were capped out on how many taxes that they could have. So they have to look at some things declining or coming off the rolls before they can add new ones. So they had a legal barrier there before they could go to the ballot, although political leadership was there and excited about the opportunity. Moving on to the next slide, please. We can talk a little bit more about language conservation. This is something that we have found and we have done, and you might have seen before. We produce regularly, and it's been a little while. COVID kind of slowed up our regular production of this. Words to use and words to avoid, and we do this based on national polling that we do, where we extrapolate from other regional and statewide polls, where we really are honing in on the words to use. And we put this out publicly for guidance. This is just a snapshot of this. There's a more extensive memo that can circulate to this group. It's from 2018, but many of those still stand up, and I'm hoping we're going to update that in 2023. A big part of that as well is the messenger. And this is what we've learned in our polling research over many years, is this key thing about messengers is the unique hat theory. And this is the first time I've had an opportunity to speak to audience of the National Park Service about this, but the iconic hats of the Park Service are just emblematic of trust that the public has for the messenger. So you guys as park rangers, those that are on the call who are great messengers to the public. The people trust you. They also trust firefighters, policemen, doctors, nurses. So we have jokingly said, we call that the funny hat theory. Don't want to make fun of y'all's hats, but iconic hat theory is really where our messengers are strongest, and that when we do advertisements and messaging, we really try to put those individuals out front wherever we can. So moving on to the next slide. Part of this messaging is once we understand the message, make sure that we are repeating it, and having that surround sound, whether it be to elected officials, to the public, and finding different ways in which that we touch upon them, because mostly people are not focused on our issues. They aren't there thinking about it, even with elections coming up. And this is always something that we struggle with when folks work on a ballot measure campaign, like we need everyone talking about it. Most people do not think about this, the election, until maybe a day or two before, and some of them not until they walk in to vote, even if they do vote. And so that's why we ensure that our ballot language, at the best we can, are as strongest as possible, because the last advertisement we have typically is that ballot language that you see when you go bubble in one of those circles. So if we have good ballot language that talks about things like healthy water, future generations, and getting outdoors, those are three of the messages that work the strongest, then we are generally in a good position to be successful. Moving on to the next one here, I just show you that some of the advertisements we've done over the years, and reflective of the messaging that we have learned. Water is always a top message. Whether we're asking for money at the ballot, whether we're working on policy, people get that connection between water and land, and that's why you see these images here of children playing in the water, especially drinking water. A lot of pictures of kids drinking glasses of water. from the water fountains. We also see that future generations, so having intergenerational photographs like the one here in the right corner from North Dakota is it's just a powerful message that people are, they may not be so concerned for themselves, but they are concerned about it for their children and grandchildren. And that's a way to move them to vote yes and motivate them to come to the polls and vote. And we've really seen, and I know the Park Service has seen this with COVID, but we were seeing this before COVID, is that an increasing message is getting outdoors and having places to go to get off screens and do that. COVID really blew that up when folks were trapped at home and wanted to get outdoors or some place to get out where they could get out of their house but be safe, and no place better than the great outdoors. The problem is when everyone goes to their state park and local park and national park, then it has effects on the park, obviously, but you don't have that space that we're looking for. So I know that's something I read about the other day is the increased numbers that the Park Service is dealing with, and how do we manage that? So moving on to the next slide, I think we're close then. I just wanted to show another work that we've done as far as messaging around wildfires in the West, and helping get funding through Congress to make sure that we have increased funding to protect communities, and we're also seeing communities raise their own dollars for prevention and protection. And I know that is a huge issue with our national parks in the West. And it's just another way in which that we apply this message research and surround sound campaigns to be successful in Congress. Next slide, please. Yep, I think that's where we're at the end. In summary, I would say that we are particularly looking at how we leverage the messages to drive people to a specific outcome. So if you ask people about climate or about the environment, it usually is not high up on folks' just general list every day. However, if we're able to localize that issue and make it very focused on taking a certain action, we want to carve out this tax in order to protect this land and do it over this period of time. What we have found by doing that is we're able to move people to action. They see themselves in it, they see the benefits, and they're willing to tax themselves to a certain degree. We're not able to go extreme levels, but we're able to see people willing to tax themselves to a certain degree in order to have that public benefit. So I'll stop there and looking forward to the opportunity for questions and answers.
Great. Thank you so much, Adam. And Brandon, if you would not, there you go. So as a reminder, folks, if you have a question, feel free to put it in the questions box there, and we'll ask it away. So Adam, Brandon, I mean, fantastic presentations, and they really complement one another, because it seems like the focus generally is on the big wins, like, you know, contact voting, passing your ballot measure, passing the IRA, you know, something that Congress, maybe the UN does in Cairo, right? In Canada, there's a biodiversity convention, you know, meeting coming up. Oh, I'd like to get your thoughts, but it seems like a lot of the focus generally for conservation is always on the really big stuff, which is obviously really important. But Brandon, these other individual actions, right? They add the momentum, they build up the steam, they power the engine to push and move the ball, right? Why do you think? I'll start with you, Brandon. Why do you think that's such a predominant part of our culture? And maybe it's just an American thing, or maybe it's an international thing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, you know, we see big problems, and I think we want big solutions maybe to match with it. But you know, I showed both, once you have a big solution, you still need everyone to come along with it and adopt it. So I think that makes sense. What there's less research around, though, is the idea that could my change in personal behavior, that I change my life a little bit, might that change my attitude about a similar related policy out there? So we've done some testing to make sure there's no negative effect, like by realizing that carbon offsets, carbon credit projects are out there as a thing an individual could do to address like a flight they had. Does that make them less likely to vote for something like a carbon tax policy? And it doesn't. There's, you know, in that case, there's not a negative impact. But I think what's interesting to explore also is on the days, you know, where you're not going to the ballot box, but are there things that you could do that maybe precondition yourself to support a certain policy? And I think that's an interesting area for exploration, because if you're looking for someone to support a, you know, some water regulation, well, I'd want to know who spends time there. Is it fishermen I want to target with my message? Well, those people have taken up a fishing behavior, right? So if I wanted to change, you know, bicycle policy in a metro area, it would be great if there were more bikers around who realized there were safety issues and would support that kind of policy. It's a bit of a long play versus just the next policy, but it's just the next election. But there's also the idea of building a constituency who've taken on something in their own life. They've changed their identity because they've become a biker. They've become someone who invests in nature. They've become this new sense by acting their way into a new belief. And then I think that belief can then show up in terms of how they support things, whether it's financially or at the ballot box. So it's an interesting way to switch identities, build new identities, and build an electorate.
Any thoughts, Adam?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that we've had, you know, some folks try to look at it from the flip side of it, go, okay, we see all these people voting in this way, so how do we extrapolate back from that to understand behavior and change behavior? And quite honestly, we are moving people to change behavior on this specific area. We're talking about ballot box because we are communicating with them. We have tight messages and everything else. Once that election day is over, we don't communicate with them. You know, we're not Coca-Cola. We can't just constantly remind you to drink a Coke, which I had a big one today. So you know, that's their and I know from a conservation aspect, we really want people to think like we do. We want them to act like we do. However, it's not ingrained in the way, and we aren't reinforcing that message. So to Brandon's point, how do we, and I really fascinated by solar, that, you know, the most likely indicator is a neighbor having that. So how do we get that start and get that emphasis, because people listen to people. They listen to people they trust, whether you have an iconic hat or, you know, you're the guy on the other side of the fence. People are going to talk to that. So how do we build that? And it's really a question of scale. At pace and scale, how do we get to that point without a organizing principle or a specific outcome to come towards that people feel like, you know, I achieved it. You know, you get on your diet and you go, look, I did it. I hit my goal, and that's where people usually slide, because they don't continue to do it because they're driving towards that outcome. So that's hard to do on a day-to-day basis, to keep driving towards that outcome over and over and over again.
Really fascinating to think about. I mean, because Brandon, so much of the resources on your website are for like individuals. Yeah, transportation, food, energy, like things that individuals can do. But then a lot of those are transferable, obviously, for communities, right? And then beyond communities, you've got the states, right? And the ballot measure efforts, right? That are powered by communities and individuals. But then, right, Adam, I mean, with some of these ballot measures, what's the correlation there, you know, with momentum building to the passage of IRA and some of these broader federal or maybe even international agreements and efforts? Isn't there kind of a continued cascading effect?
I think there is, and sometimes it's a reminder because it's a crowded space. There's a lot of issues that people are looking at. I kind of joke when my mother was a art professor for 50 years, and so she doesn't like it when I say this, but red and blue can really mean green, and this is where we've learned in this is that that there are those commonalities where we have very stark districts that are decided in primaries. Green issues can be commonalities. How we raise the consciousness of those, how we're able to drive those is critical. So you see a state have or a county have a ballot measure win like that, then that gets into the consciousness and can lead into another. Tracking that and metrics on that, that's harder to do, but that's where we're also looking at champions. Who are the people that we can move on this, that understands that we sometimes do polling that goes, we don't do electoral polling, but we do ask in a general sense, if you're a member of Congress, if you're a member of the legislature, your governor, supported proposals like these, would you be more or less likely to vote? And so most of the time it is more likely, and what we're at least able to go is, yes, we know you have downward pressure from other people. This issue is not going to get you unelected. It may not be the issue that gets you elected, but it is a safe space for you to keep moving forward. And that's where I see the commonality with green issues for both Democrats and Republicans.
We're getting some really interesting and fun questions and comments. One of the comments was here, social expectations do work. We installed a solar array on our home in 2014. Now the 5 other homes in our rural Vermont neighborhood all have solar installations, both rooftop and ground mount. So that's a really fascinating comment or thing that you mentioned there, Brandon. What are your recommendations, Brandon and Adam? I mean, in terms of, there is a lot of Park Service folks on the phone, on the webinar here. Rangers, it's amazing that magic hat, yeah, like you said, Adam, really, it does. People trust you, they respect you, and they have lots of questions. That comes with the territory. So how can the Park Service, how can other federal agencies really play a bigger leadership role with, beyond kind of making these investments and having solar panels on visitor centers and things like that? Are there other things that we can be doing to better communicate and support, these actions that individuals, communities, et cetera, can take to combat climate change?
Who wants to go first? Brandon, you want to take this one first?
Okay, sure, I'll try. I think talking about it is great. Finding the situations that you run into frequently, so you have a chance to practice and go, okay, next time that comes up, how will I realize that's an opportunity for me? It may be first with a colleague before you try it with general public or something like that. But I'll also put in a link as a response answer to this, a set of 8 principles that we developed based on research about what actually works in terms of communicating about climate. And my point isn't to just go, hey, use all 8. But what we find is really effective is if you realize a situation comes up recurringly, find the 1 or 2 principles that would work really well in that situation. Like making it personal to the person. Find out what they care about. This is something Catherine Hayhoe talks a lot about. Find something that's valuable to them and talk about it first in terms of what they value and how that connects to climate, rather than just spouting science or your personal beliefs about climate. Connect to the values that they have.
Yeah, building off that, I think that's tremendous, Brandon. I think because Park Service employees are seen as such trusted messengers that, one of the things that we have done well in this country is our national park system. It's iconic across the globe. Having that arrowhead, Flint arrowhead there, everyone knows what that is. And so anything that is happening on Park Service sites that we can incorporate and have those messages to people. I think you guys are that conduit. Of course, you know, we're not asking you to get in areas of politics or advocating for or against a ballot measure, but being able to show that as an example and be that leader, and bring in more people in that opportunity, and more than just going for hikes and enjoying the beauty of it. That educational aspect, I think, is so critical, and there's a lot that can be transferred through those conversations.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, we've got you know, there's a lot of focus and efforts around climate change and Park Service, but always remind people, it's like, you know, we're not going to fix this. You know, we can do all we want inside parks, and we should, right? You know, smart investments with electric vehicles and things like that. But it's the broader public. It's all the above in terms of actually addressing this in a real way. Brandon, this kind of came up in an earlier, the last webinar with Brooke Tolley, you know, who used to work there at RARE, and Sarah Molina with the Park Service. They were focusing on, you know, how do you motivate individuals to take action? What are your thoughts with, you know, is it motivating individuals, or is it not knowing what to do? Like, I feel like what RARE has done is kind of breaking it down into those four categories is digestible and it makes a lot of sense. And maybe they speak to some people who go after one and not the other for whatever reason. But at least it's something that's clear and upfront on these are the areas you can help. Is that the issue or the need, or is it also, or actually just getting people to do something? Because a lot of us know we should be doing X, Y, or Z, but don't do it, right?
Right. And I think that's, again, why I go to the interesting cases of making it social and making it collective that can help people along. Some of the most effective campaigns, for example, we've seen on solar is a group called Solarize that says, okay, one of the challenges is that solar feels like this good idea you might do, but you're going to put off till next season, and then next season, and then next season.
Yeah.
But if I say, hey, in your community, we're going to get, you know, we're going to start in a few weeks. You need to sign up with your friends, and then we will collectively, you know, get a cheaper price for solar overall, taking away another barrier. You're going to go through it together, so you know you're going to solve. You know, if you run into problems, you have some other people to help you through. And these are much more highly effective because it's a we going through it, and it takes away a lot of the barriers. So I think it's also creating interventions, as we would call it from a behavior science standpoint. You might call it a campaign, you might call it a collective, to go through these things in a way that has a much higher likelihood of success. So yeah, that creates the motivation, but it also solves many of these other little problems and obstacles to get in the way.
That makes sense. What are the unknowns, like for social science, in trying to get people to support the ballot measures or to take conservation actions? It seems like social science, you know, there's a lot of always, you know, for climate change and biodiversity, just generally, there's a lot of hard science on, you know, water, air, whatever, but there's a lot less investments and awareness for the social science. Again, the human behavior part, like why are they checking that box, or, you know, getting the electric vehicle, or, you know, whatever. Why do you think that is, and what do you think needs to happen in better understanding the unknown, so, you know, all the conservation community can work more strategically to you know, be more effective?
I'll take that first, Adam.
Yeah, you want me to take it first, or you take it first?
You.
Okay, yeah, I'd say it's value and values, and that's where I think we've seen in doing the research and understanding the messages and what those pain points are, understanding where people have shared values and communicating that way and showing that the solution that we have here, and it's focused in a ballot measure or focused in a policy campaign, this is the solution, well, it is aligned with your values. It reinforces what you already believe, and this is a tangible manifestation of what you believe in policy or in tax reform or whatever it might be. The other part of that is the value is that, people will say, I believe in this, I care about this. However, I must first feed my family, must have a job, those type of things. So if we are asking too much of them, I mean, it's really, we have found about $25 a month is about the tipping point where we start losing people. So if at any point we get beyond that, we're really pushing the threshold here. And so, I mean, that's human nature. I mean, you're going to protect yourself, and if it costs too much and you can't feed your family, or so it's seen as such, you're going to not be with it, even if it's very well aligned with your values. So we have to find that sweet spot. And this is why I think we've won a lot of campaigns. We have a lot that are on the editing room floor because we couldn't find that right mix of value and values in order to move people to yes. So we went with the ones that had that and were likely to win. We need to stretch ourselves more. I think we can move people in a further direction, but it is an incremental process. You're not going to jump from being opposed to being for. Usually those that are core opposed, we don't even talk to. We're trying to move those people in the middle and reinforce those people that are already with us.
Thoughts, Brandon?
Couldn't say it better, so we'll leave it with that.
So what about this issue of, well, it's not an issue. I mean, what about equity? I mean, a lot of these, like you said, Adam, this cost of $25 a month, but, again, for some of those items, there's 4 areas, that RARE has, Brandon, well, this is all about money. So how does equity come into all of this?
Yeah, it's a good question and important that Leah asked it, so I really appreciate it. Because when you look at the full behaviors of the set, it's like, oh, that could really, even with subsidies from the government, that could add up a little bit, or tax incentives from the government. But we don't look at those as a full set that everyone must do. So first of all, let's recognize that those who are most at risk are in historically marginalized groups, are often the least responsible for historical carbon emissions, and they have the lowest carbon emissions today, right? So some of this is like, hey, we're looking at you high income people to take a step up and do the right thing. But what I don't want to happen is that we encourage behaviors only among, and the people who get the co-benefits from those behaviors are high net income. So we want to make sure and say, oh, you know what, eating a plant-based diet actually has great health outcomes as well, and we want to encourage that across the population because it is accessible to everyone. But there's some myths to overcome, like eating more vegetables doesn't mean you have to shop at Whole Foods, right?
Right.
In fact, the communities that eat the most plant-rich diets tend to be the historically marginalized groups, and I think that's really interesting to hold them up as the right models. Community solar is another program that I'm super excited about with the IRA because you can also tie jobs and training and new things that you can bring to these communities that are huge co-benefits beyond just having cleaner energy in your home, which also less natural gas and more electric in your home is a huge benefit as well.
Yeah, and I would add, I mean, one barrier that we're looking at is tax policy in and of itself. I mean, we worked on a ballot measure in Beaufort County in South Carolina. It was a sales tax for green space. I mean, we know sales taxes are regressive, but that was what was passed by the legislature to allow them to do it. So the county went after that. So how can we shift tax policy in such a way? And usually in localities, they are limited in what they can do. In many places, the only option they have is sales tax increases, which then again perpetuates on poverty and issues. So having folks included in the beginning, sitting at the table and deciding, here's the space that we want to move in and here's how we want to move in it, I think develops better policies and better plans of action that have positive outcomes instead of, you know, us in a White Castle room figuring this out and then decreeing it upon all the people. So that's what we're trying to move towards, is do the research and understand the implications of the things that we're trying to do.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much for presenting and spending some time with us today. It's fantastic presentations, great conversation, and it really, I don't know, this is a really good way to end the year and the progression of our focus, you know, thinking about what individuals can do, and there's a lot of momentum there, and it seems like a lot of the focus is always on, I hate to say this, but like the Hail Mary, big effort, big successes, which sometimes happen, like IRA, you know, that are going to make a big impact. But, you know, it's all the other things in between, the community, the state level, the community level, the local, your neighbor, you know, what your own personal actions, all those matter as well. So it's like an all of the above, and it's like, I feel like it's like, yeah, getting that kid to plant the milkweed and understanding that and getting that, you know, the sparks only builds and has a snowballing effect with unforeseen consequences. Maybe that person grows up to put a conservation easement on their family property, right? I mean, there's all these other things that can happen that we just don't know. So it all makes sense. It's got to be right, all the above. So thank you for making that really clear. It's you know, states are people, the U.S. is people, communities are people. So it all adds up. So any last thoughts, Adam or Brandon?
Now, just really want to thank you and thanks everyone who attended. And if in any way our team can be helpful to you, please reach out, let us know.
Likewise, same sentiment from me. Brian, you're a great host, so thank you. Yeah, everyone obviously showed up today because they feel concerned, maybe anxious about what's going on. And I think there's a world where it's a desirable future where we're overall healthier, saving more money, doing the right things, and have good outcomes over the long haul. And so my request would be, just whether it's voting related or something in your life, choose something to do today, try it out, and it actually becomes a talking point for what you can tell others you're doing about it, because that's the number one thing that lowers anxiety, is doing something.
To that. Thank you again, Adam and Brandon, and folks, stay tuned for this series will continue in the next year. Again, looking at individual actions that can help nature and parks. We're going to have a couple of interesting webinars already planned, just not nailed down. One on recreation and how that can support conservation, the challenges and opportunities around that, and then another on focusing on the Mountain Neighbor Handbook that Grand Teton, the town of Jackson, Teton County, and others developed. That is a really awesome tool for bringing the communities together and looking at conservation opportunities. So stay tuned for that. And with that, thank you again for joining, and thank you again, Adam and Brandon. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.